It's been a while since we've covered a good old witch legend. Those stories seem to be all over, or at least here in the South. You know, I hate using the word witch, but unfortunately, that's all we have. Throughout history, it was a blanket term used to label anyone strange, bizarre, or not Catholic. If you study the old cases enough, you'll see what I mean. Perhaps someone was just a natural healer. Maybe they followed the ways of their ancestors and family traditions. As much as the spreading Catholic Church throughout Europe did their best to blend local traditions in with church traditions to quote-unquote civilize the cultures they encountered, that was a one-way street. It was okay for the church to do that. But if you adopted the new religion of the land, but tried to squeeze in some of your old beliefs, well, let's just say things wouldn't end too well. The persecution of so-called witches swept over Europe in medieval times, and even made the jump across the ocean to America at some point. You should all be familiar with the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692, right? I remember writing a research paper on that subject back in the 1990s while attending a private Christian high school. Fun times, as you can imagine. Lucky for me, though, I had a supportive English teacher that knew how I approached subjects, so she convinced the school to basically sit back and let me roll with it. I got an A for anyone interested. Anyway, those old stories have always intrigued me, but there's always been one peculiar thing that researchers will point out, but never really address. When people think about the execution of witches, people automatically think about being burned at the stake. That was the predominant method back in the day, after all. But not here in America, and I have a theory as to why. Burning was predominantly a Catholic thing, the whole cleansed by fire approach. As far as America, it started off as a Protestant nation, and tried to put as much separation between itself and Catholicism as possible. The Catholic way of execution was labeled barbaric, so we turned to hangings, with the exception of Giles Corey, who was basically placed under a wooden plank. Then they piled stones on top of it until he was no more. So much for humane, right? As far as history tells us, there were no witches burnt at the stake in America. That's what they tell us. But then again, they play with semantics a little. I'll agree, from all of my research, they're telling you the truth. There were no witches burnt at the stake in America. But if we tweak that statement just a bit and remove the, quote, at the stake, then we have something. There was one recorded event of a witch being burned alive in America. One. And wouldn't you know it? It happened in the South. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. Battletown, Kentucky is a small, unincorporated community in Meade County on the Ohio River at the border of Kentucky and Indiana. Battletown got its name in 1885, but our story goes back a little further than that, so let's just start at the beginning. Leah Smock was born in Virginia in the year 1818, the oldest of 3 siblings, to John and Margaret Smock. It seemed that John and Margaret were both accustomed to moving around a lot, something that would stay consistent even after marrying and starting a family. John Smock was from New Jersey, and Margaret was from Pennsylvania. It isn't clear where or how the two met, but we do know that Leah was born in Virginia, so it's apparent that John and Margaret had both left their hometowns at some point. Both parents are described as baptized Christians, and by all accounts, they raised their children that way also. The mother, Margaret, was of Scottish descent though, and there are some surviving witness accounts that leads one to believe that she held on to a lot of what her family referred to as the old ways. And there is speculation that Margaret taught Leah some of these traditions as well. But whether this is true or was just added to the legend after the fact is hard to prove. You'll see why later on, but let's not jump the gun here. Leah Smock was described as a beautiful child with long black hair and fair skin. History remembers her as always being overly intelligent and was often found carrying her own in adult conversations. It's even said that Leah finished school at an early age, the teachers she had on their family's travels claiming that Leah already knew everything they were capable of teaching her. Legend has it that around the age of 12, Leah began to show the ability to see the future, telling of events around them before they even happened. She was extremely accurate with predicting weather and seasonal changes. People even started the claims that Leah had the ability to look at someone that was sick and tell them whether they would die or not. If she said they were going to die, Leah could even tell them when, even contradicting their attending doctors. These abilities weren't completely unheard of, especially in the area of the Appalachians. People with these supposed abilities were even sought out and praised in those mountain communities. But as the Smock family continued their travels, they would quickly find out that the rest of the world didn't operate quite like the Appalachian people. The Smock family continued moving around, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, and ultimately settled in Meade County, Kentucky in 1839, where John Smock bought 300 acres of farmland. The family farmed and raised cattle, but John's primary trade was that of a cooper. A cooper was one who handcrafts wooden barrels, and although your mind probably went to whiskey barrels since we're talking about Kentucky, the area of Meade County was known for something different. The land itself was rich in limestone, and a booming industry had cropped up around it. People would break the rock down to lime dust and ship it downriver to be sold in New Orleans. As luck would have it for John Smock, containers were in constant need to ship all of that lime dust day in and day out, and his barrels fit the bill just right. Leah was in her early 20s now by this time. She worked alongside her father in his cooper's business, as well as helped care for her 2 younger siblings. The Smock family was respected well enough in the area, but Leah, not so much. Her mannerisms were seen as peculiar, and her predictions and such made people nervous and kept them a little on edge. She was kept at arm's length in the community and ostracized. Leah did make one friend though, a native man named Jim, who locals called Indian Joe. Indian Joe was from the other side of the Ohio River in Indiana. The main theory is that the two met in the forest shortly after the Smocks arrived to the area. Leah was known to spend most of her free time alone in the woods, gathering wild berries, flowers, and herbs. Some speculate that these would be used in healing remedies possibly, but for the locals in what would become Battletown, these actions just led to more rumors that perhaps Leah was gathering ingredients for spells or potions. Another thing that added to the townspeople's wariness of Leah was her friendship with Indian Joe. It had become obvious that Indian Joe had become someone that Leah confided in, and many speculated that Indian Joe shared a lot of his native lore and beliefs with Leah, something locals regarded as sorcery. One story has it that two men were going to build a cabin on the land that Indian Joe was hoping to buy one day. Leah approached the men in the forest one day and advised them against it, simply saying that the land was not for them. The men just laughed it off, but shortly after that, one of the men suffered an accident that left him badly injured and unable to make a living. The other man reportedly went crazy. The next time Leah saw Indian Joe, she told him that the land was meant to be his, and he was able to buy the land later, and reportedly lived on that same piece of land until 1914, when he died around the age of 90 years old. To add fuel to the fire in the mind of locals back in the 1800s, though, Leah walked through the woods with a large staff that Indian Joe had crafted for her, one with a carved snake's head on top of it. Legend also has it that Leah developed a kinship with the wildlife in the forest. The fox and the coyotes were said to act like pets around her, and people started to murmur that Leah had the ability to tame them. People found this strange, so the rumors about Leah grew and grew. The stories about her grew to claim that Leah Smock was a witch, and the already distant townspeople started to harass her, something that legend says Leah didn't take too kindly to. Whenever people would begin to ridicule Leah, they say that Leah would get a distant look in her eyes and simply tilt her head to the side, as if she were contemplating her revenge. A group of boys followed Leah into the woods one day and cornered her, taunting her with calls of being a witch. Leah responded the same way, staring them down, staying quiet and distant the whole time, causing the boys to get scared and take off. There are two prevailing stories as to the outcome of that situation. One says that the boys were found later that night, wandering the forest, completely out of their minds. The other story? Well, it says that the boys never made it home, and were never seen again. Another story has a neighbor of the Smocks getting 2 new horses. Leah, being an animal lover, rushed over to see them. She wanted to pet them, but the owner said absolutely not. He was well aware of the stories circulating about Leah, and he wasn't about to take any chances. Well, being the strong-willed woman that she was, Leah reached out to pet one of the horses anyway. She ran her hand down the muzzle of the horse briefly before the neighbor grabbed her and drug her off his property. The next morning, that horse was found dead. The second horse was dead a day later. Of course, this was all blamed on Leah, and things continued to escalate. A woman in town had recently given birth to a child. Neighbors came around to see the newest member of the community and to give their congratulations. As well did the Smock family. Leah wanted to hold the baby, but the mother snapped at her, telling Leah not to come near her child. As the story goes, Leah stared the woman down, then declared that the child would be dead by morning. And Leah was right. The next morning, the infant was found dead, and Leah Smock was immediately blamed for the child's death. Community members gathered to pay their respects, and Leah herself showed up as well. As she approached the small casket, family members of the recently deceased grabbed her and dragged her from the house. Leah returned that night, though, to speak her piece to the family, but they would not receive her. That's when, as the story goes, something strange happened. All of the cats and dogs from the area descended on the home. The cats all climbed to the roof, screeching and clawing at the roof, and the dogs circled the home and howled and howled. The chaos from the animals went on and on until, eventually, the men of the family had had enough. They came out and dragged Leah from the property, at which time the animals all quieted and left the scene. As all of these events were going on in the community, the townspeople's livelihood was also attacked. For no apparent reason, the coopers in the area started having problems with their barrels just falling apart. No matter what they did, it just seemed that their barrels would not hold together. All of the coopers in the area were having the same problem. All that is, except for John Smock. The townspeople were convinced that Leah Smock had cursed them all. I mean, what other explanation was there? None that they could come up with. They grew more and more desperate as the days went on, until they decided that the only way they could survive was to get rid of the supposed witch in their midst. They waited until one day they found out that the Smock family were traveling into town for supplies, but that Leah chose to stay behind. Once the family was a good distance away, some of the men of Battletown descended on the Smock home and dragged Leah outside, took her to a large smokehouse on the property, and locked her inside. The smokehouse was then set ablaze. Before long, the people in the surrounding area were alerted to what was going on by the screams of Leah Smock, and those further away came by too, their curiosity piqued by the growing plume of smoke that was filling the sky. At one point, John and Margaret Smock saw the growing amount of smoke as well, and knowing the area that it was coming from, they turned and rushed home, fearing the worst. When they got there, the smokehouse was fully ablaze, and the heat was too intense to get close enough to do anything about it. There was a large crowd on the property, just watching it burn. No one doing anything about it. It's said that Margaret Smock dropped to the ground, her cries for mercy nearly as loud as the trapped daughter's screams for help. Leah's parents could do nothing but stand there until their daughter's screams stopped. According to legend, Margaret refused to leave the site until the remains of Leah could be recovered, something that took days due to the heat of the smoldering remains of the smokehouse. Once the remains were eventually recovered, the Smock family placed them in a wooden casket and buried what was left of Leah Smock in secret on the family farm. They left the grave unmarked, in fear of what locals might do later on. But an unknown person later visited the site and left a marker for Leah, crudely carved in a piece of limestone. It simply read, "Leah Smock, departed this life August 21st, 1840, aged 22 years, 7 months. A little more than a week after Leah's death, 2 men were out hunting near the burial site and saw what they claimed was the spirit of Leah Smock. They immediately left the area, but they were so scared that Leah's ghost would continue to plague the community that they returned later with 2 wagon loads of sandstone. They proceeded to dig a pit at the grave, 3 feet deep, and filled it with stones in an effort to keep the spirit down. They used so much rock that it not only filled the hole that they had dug, but the pile of stone continued until it sat 3 feet above the ground as well. This didn't work though, as sightings continued. People that claimed to witness the spirit of Leah Smock all described the same thing. A young woman dressed in white robes or a dress, with black ties at each wrist and around the waist. The spirit was described as having long black hair, deep dark eyes, and is always seen floating just above the ground. These sightings continued on for generations and continue to persist even today. The burial site sat alone for 25 years before it was converted to Elizabeth Daily Cemetery and received any more burials. The cemetery itself is small, with only 21 known grave markers, and today sits on private property, only accessible by about a 1-mile hike from the nearest road. People claim that the spirit of Leah Smock still roams the cemetery grounds and surrounding forest. Sightings still take place, and they say Leah still protects the wildlife in the area, and in turn, the wildlife protects Leah Smock. Those brave enough to venture out to the secluded cemetery have more to worry about than the spirit of Leah Smock. People claim that the grounds of the cemetery is infested with both rattlesnake and copperheads, but just the cemetery grounds, and that they all seem to congregate around Leah's grave itself, as if guarding her remains. Hunters in the area have all but given up on the woods surrounding the Elizabeth Daily Cemetery. People today say no one is able to kill any game there, even skilled marksmen. They see wild game, but every shot that is taken seems to miss. Locals say that not a single animal has been taken from that area in generations. They say Leah Smock will not allow it. Generations of families in Battletown have kept these stories alive, thus keeping the legacy and memory of Leah Smock herself alive. A local man in the 1970s set out to collect as many of these stories as he could find, not only to get closure to a sighting of Leah that he had had himself, but to also see what historical truths he could find. He was quoted in a newspaper article in 1975 as saying, "The people they thought was witches back then was just regular folks who had a little too much IQ." These collected stories eventually led others to want to know more about Leah Smock, and the Meade County Tourism Board thinks that maybe they have found an alternative reason for Leah's murder. Back in that time frame, most of the counties in Kentucky were owned by single landowners from out of town, and those people would hire others to break up the land into plots and sell them on their behalf. It was common for landowners and purchasers alike to get scammed sometimes, where plots of land were sold twice. Documents show that this happened to Leah Smock's father, John, And in 1840, the year of Leah's death, John Smock was in a legal dispute with another man, both claiming to have the deed to the property that John Smock's farm was on. Perhaps they are right, and this is the source of everything. Or perhaps the legends are true, and the land dispute was a last-ditch effort to get the Smocks to take Leah and leave the area. In recent years, the people of Meade County claim to have taken a closer look at the life of Leah Smock, and have chosen to celebrate Leah as a person rather than focus on the legends that persist about her. Starting in 2022, Meade County held a festival to celebrate the life of Leah Smock, and has held it every year since. Their goal is to bring awareness to Leah Smock, the person, claiming that the old legends calling her a witch is nothing but a disservice, even though they took to calling the event the Battletown Witch Festival, and choose to have it during the Halloween season each year. But hey, que sera, sera. As far as the sightings of Leah Smock's spirit, it is what it is. Regardless if you believe she was truly a witch or not, doesn't matter. Neither scenario discounts the hundreds of sightings of her spirit throughout the years. Either Leah Smock was a witch and still lingers in the area of Battletown, Kentucky, or she was the victim of ignorance of the day and has yet to find the ability to rest in peace. Perhaps she fell victim because of the land dispute, rather intentionally or by accident from a threat that got out of hand. Either way would cause her soul to be restless until something could be done to bring about peace. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the stigma of being labeled the only witch to be burned alive in American history that keeps her up at night, so to speak.